I'm going to tell you something that happened to me 3 years ago. Something that changed everything I thought I knew about family, about love, and about the people you trust most in this world. But before I do, I need you to understand something first. What I'm about to share isn't just my story, it's a warning. It's proof that the people closest to you, the ones you'd die for, the ones you've sacrificed everything for, they might be the very ones planning your destruction. My name is Eugene Matthews. I'm 67 years old and I thought I knew what betrayal looked like. I was wrong. If this story sounds familiar to you, if you've ever felt that cold realization that someone you love has been playing a long game against you, then hit that subscribe button right now. Because what I'm about to tell you isn't just about me. It's about every parent who's ever wondered if their adult children truly care. Every father who's ever questioned whether his sacrifices meant anything at all. And if you stick with me to the end, you'll understand why sometimes the most devastating revenge isn't what you do to someone else. It's what you do to yourself. The heart attack hit me on a Tuesday morning in October. I remember because I was supposed to meet my financial advisor that afternoon to discuss some investments. Ironic, really, considering what I discovered later about where my money had actually been going. I was in my kitchen, making coffee the way I had every morning for 40 years since my wife Patricia died. Black, no sugar, hot enough to burn your tongue if you weren't careful. The pain started as a tight band across my chest, like someone was slowly tightening a belt around my ribs. Then it spread down my left arm, and I knew. You hear about people calling 911 during heart attacks, but let me tell you something about being alone when death comes knocking. Your first instinct isn't to call strangers. It's to call family. It's to call the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally. I managed to dial my son Derek's number while gripping the kitchen counter so hard I left nail marks in the wood. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, then straight to voicemail. His voice, casual and carefree, telling me to leave a message and he'd get back to me soon. Soon. I might have laughed if I wasn't dying. But let me tell you something about that voicemail message, something that didn't occur to me until much later. Derek's voice sounded different on that recording than it had the last time I'd called him. Lighter, happier, like a man who'd just gotten good news. I tried calling again, thinking maybe the first call had dropped. Same result. Straight to voicemail after 3 rings. Not the kind of busy signal you get when someone's actually on another call, but the deliberate kind that happens when someone sees your name and decides not to answer. So I called his wife, Monica. Sweet Monica, who'd been part of our family for 8 years, who called me Dad, who always remembered my birthday and sent me pictures of my grandchildren. The phone didn't even ring. It went straight to voicemail, like she'd seen my name and declined the call. But here's what I found out later, something that still chills me to the bone. Monica's phone had been turned off for less than 30 seconds when I called, just long enough to see my name on the screen and make a decision. That decision wasn't to help her father-in-law who was having a heart attack. It was to protect whatever they were doing that they didn't want interrupted. I tried Derek one more time, my vision starting to blur, my left arm completely numb now. This time I didn't even get voicemail. The call went straight to that automated message telling me the person I was trying to reach wasn't available. He'd turned his phone off too, both of them. In the space of 2 minutes, both my son and daughter-in-law had actively chosen to make themselves unreachable to me. That's when the real panic set in. Not from the heart attack, from the realization that I was truly, completely alone. I dialed 911 with shaking fingers, and the last thing I remember before collapsing on my kitchen floor was the dispatcher asking me if there was anyone they could call for me, anyone who should be notified. I gave them Derek's number. Even then, even as my heart was literally failing me, I believed my son would come. I woke up 18 hours later in the cardiac intensive care unit of St. Mary's Hospital. Tubes down my throat, machines beeping around me like some kind of electronic symphony of survival. The first thing I did when they removed the breathing tube was ask the nurse if my family had been called. She looked uncomfortable. You know that look medical professionals get when they have to deliver news that's going to hurt? She had that look. Her name was Jennifer, I learned later. A kind woman in her 40s who'd been working in cardiac care for 15 years. She'd seen families react to medical emergencies in every way imaginable, but she told me later that what happened with Derek was unusual. They'd called Derek's number multiple times. He'd answered once, she told me, acknowledged that, yes, I was his father, and said he'd be there as soon as he could. But then Jennifer shared details that made my blood run cold. Derek's voice on that call, she said, hadn't sounded panicked or worried or rushed. He'd sounded inconvenienced. When Jennifer had explained the severity of my condition, that I'd had a massive heart attack and was in critical condition, Derek had actually asked if it could wait until the weekend. If it could wait. Like my near-death experience was a dentist appointment that might be rescheduled for his convenience. Jennifer had explained, as gently as she could, that heart attacks don't wait for convenient timing. That's when Derek had said he'd be there as soon as he could, but he had some things to take care of first. Things to take care of first. While his father was lying in intensive care, fighting for his life. That was Tuesday evening. It was now Wednesday afternoon. No one had come. But that wasn't all Jennifer told me. Over the course of my stay, she shared more details that painted a picture I wasn't ready to see. The hospital had called Derek's number 6 more times over the next 24 hours, following standard protocol for notifying family members about patients in critical condition. Each time, the call had gone to voicemail. They'd left detailed messages explaining my status, my room number, visiting hours, and the importance of family support during cardiac recovery. Derek had never called back. They'd also tried Monica's number, using the emergency contact information in my wallet. Same result. Voicemail after voicemail, messages that were never returned. But here's the part that Jennifer found most disturbing, the part that made her remember my case long after I'd been discharged. On Wednesday morning, someone had called the hospital's main number asking about my condition. Not Derek, not Monica, not anyone claiming to be family. It had been a woman's voice, Jennifer said, asking if Eugene Matthews was still alive, and if so, what his prognosis was. When the receptionist had asked who was calling and what her relationship to the patient was, the woman had hung up. 30 minutes later, the same woman had called back and asked if Eugene Matthews had any visitors, if anyone from his family had been to see him. When told that family notification was private information, the woman had hung up again. Jennifer suspected it might have been Monica, checking to see if I was still alive, if anyone else had shown up, if her absence had been noticed. She was monitoring the situation, but from a safe distance. They were keeping track of whether I died, but they weren't interested in being there if I lived. Let me pause here for a moment because I need you to understand something about Derek. This wasn't some estranged relationship. This wasn't a father and son who'd been feuding for years. Derek was my only child, my pride and joy, the kid I'd coached in Little League and taught to drive, and walked down the aisle at his wedding. But there were signs I'd been ignoring for months, maybe years. The Sunday phone calls that had once lasted an hour had gradually shortened to 15 minutes, then 10, then 5. Derek would call while doing other things. I could hear him typing or talking to Monica in the background or dealing with the kids. I was background noise in my own son's life. The visits had become less frequent too. There was always a reason. Work was busy, the kids had activities, Monica wasn't feeling well, the car needed repairs. Individual excuses that seemed reasonable, but together painted a picture of a family that was slowly pulling away. The conversations had changed too. Derek used to ask about my life, my health, my plans. He used to tell me stories about work, about the kids, about things he was thinking about or worried about. But gradually, our talks had become transactional. He'd call to ask for something, advice about a business decision, help with a financial problem, babysitting for the grandchildren. And once he got what he needed, the call would end. I'd been so grateful for any contact with him that I hadn't noticed I was being used instead of loved. And the money. God, the money I'd given him over the years without ever asking for accountability or even acknowledgement. When Derek had started his consulting business 5 years earlier, I'd given him $50,000 from my retirement fund. No questions asked, no loan documents, no expectation of repayment. It was a gift from a father who believed in his son's dreams. When they'd wanted to buy the bigger house in the better school district, I'd co-signed the mortgage and put down $20,000 for the closing costs. When little Eugene had needed surgery for a hernia when he was 3, I'd paid the insurance deductible and the portion the insurance didn't cover. $4,000 that I handed over without hesitation because family takes care of family. When Monica had wanted to go back to school to get her master's degree, I'd paid the tuition. $18,000 spread over 2 years. When their air conditioning system had died in the middle of summer, I'd bought them a new one. When Derek's business had hit a rough patch and they couldn't make their car payments, I'd paid them off. Over the years, I'd given Derek and Monica over $150,000. Not loans, gifts. Money I'd worked 40 years to save. Money I'd planned to leave them anyway, but decided to give while I was alive so I could see them benefit from it. And in all that time, Derek had never once said thank you. Not really. He'd say thanks in the moment. But it was the kind of perfunctory thanks you give the cashier at the grocery store. Expected, automatic, meaningless. More telling, he'd never once said no. He'd never turned down money I offered, never suggested that maybe I was giving too much, never expressed concern that I might be jeopardizing my own financial security by being so generous. He'd taken everything I offered and then gradually started asking for more. The requests had become more frequent, more casual, more entitled. Derek would mention a problem. The roof needed repairs. Monica's car was making a strange noise. They wanted to take the kids to Disney World, and then wait for me to offer to pay for it. If I didn't offer immediately, he'd bring it up again, and again, until I finally understood that solving Derek's problems had become my responsibility. I'd been so focused on being a generous father that I'd failed to notice I was raising a son who saw me as a solution to his problems, rather than a person deserving of his love. I spent 3 more days in that hospital. 3 days of surgeries, of doctors explaining about blocked arteries and stents and lifestyle changes I'd need to make. 3 days of nurses asking gently if there was anyone else they could call. 3 days of watching the door, expecting at any moment to see Derek's face, to hear Monica's voice, to feel the chaos that comes with children visiting their grandpa in the hospital. But I also spent those 3 days thinking, really thinking, maybe for the first time in years. I thought about the last conversation I'd had with Derek before the heart attack. He'd called on Sunday as usual, but the call had been different, shorter, more impatient. Derek had been dealing with some problem at work, some client who was unhappy with his services and threatening to take their business elsewhere. As he'd told me about it, I'd offered some suggestions based on my own experience in business. Derek had cut me off mid-sentence. "Dad, I've got this handled," he'd said, his voice sharp with irritation. "I don't need you to solve all my problems for me." But then, not 10 minutes later, he'd mentioned that their lawnmower had broken and they needed to buy a new one. He'd mentioned it 3 times in the remaining 5 minutes of our conversation. Derek didn't want my advice, but he definitely wanted my money. I'd bought them that lawnmower, an expensive riding mower that Derek had researched and selected, which I'd ordered online and had delivered to their house. $800 that I'd spent without question, because taking care of Derek's problems had become my default response to everything. Lying in that hospital bed, I started to understand something that should have been obvious. Derek didn't call me every Sunday because he missed me or wanted to hear my voice. He called me every Sunday because it was part of managing his financial resource. Me. I was a resource to be managed, not a father to be loved. The realization was devastating, but it was also clarifying. For the first time, Derek's absence from the hospital made sense. Resources don't need emotional support. Resources don't require bedside visits or worried phone calls or flowers. Resources just need to keep functioning so they can continue to provide what's needed. Derek's absence wasn't personal. It was practical. He was maintaining professional distance from a business relationship. On Friday, a social worker named Janet came to see me. She was a kind woman, probably in her 50s, with gray hair and gentle eyes that had seen too much. She sat in the plastic chair beside my bed and asked me about my discharge plan. That's when it hit me. I didn't have one. I lived alone. I'd need help for the next few weeks, maybe months. I'd need someone to drive me to follow-up appointments, to help with groceries, to make sure I was taking my medications correctly. Janet had clearly read my chart and knew about my family situation. She was gentle but direct in her questions. Did I have any family members who could assist with my recovery? Did I have friends or neighbors who might be able to check on me regularly? Did I have a support system of any kind? The honest answer to all those questions was no. Derek and Monica had been my support system, my emergency contacts, my next of kin. I'd assumed they would always be there when I needed them, because I'd always been there when they needed me. But assumption isn't the same thing as reality. Janet explained the options: home health care services, assisted living facilities, adult day programs. She had brochures for everything, glossy pamphlets full of smiling elderly people who looked nothing like how I felt. As Janet talked, I found myself wondering about those people in the brochures. How many of them had ended up in assisted living because their families had simply stopped showing up? How many had discovered in their hour of greatest need that the relationships they'd counted on were more fragile than they'd believed? That afternoon, while Janet was helping me complete paperwork for a home health aide, I did something I'd never done before. I hired a private investigator. His name was Sam Kowalski, a former police detective who specialized in family matters. I called him from my hospital bed, using the business card a nurse had given me. Apparently, Sam was someone the hospital social workers recommended to patients who suspected family members might be taking advantage of them, financially or emotionally. I'd never imagined I'd be one of those patients. Sam came to see me that evening. He was a big man with sad eyes and calloused hands, the kind of person who'd seen enough of humanity's darkness to expect the worst, but still hoped for the best. I told him everything. About Derek, about Monica, about the phone calls that went unanswered and the son who never came. I told him about the money I'd given over the years, about the gradual changes in our relationship, about the growing sense that something was fundamentally wrong with the dynamic between us. I told him I needed to know if something had happened to them, if there was some reason they couldn't come to the hospital. But even as I said it, I knew that wasn't really what I wanted to know. What I really wanted to know was whether Derek's absence was circumstantial or intentional, whether my son had failed to come because he couldn't, or because he'd chosen not to. Sam listened without judgment, took notes in a small leather notebook, and promised to have answers within 48 hours. Those were the longest 48 hours of my life. I was discharged on Sunday morning. The hospital arranged for a medical transport service to take me home, and I walked back into my house alone. The coffee cup I'd been making when the heart attack hit was still on the counter, a ring of mold floating on top of the cold liquid. The sight of it made me sick to my stomach. My house felt different, emptier somehow, even though nothing had changed. The family photos on the mantelpiece seemed to mock me. Derek's graduation picture, his wedding photos, pictures of my grandchildren, little Eugene and Sarah, playing in my backyard last Christmas. I sat in my recliner, the one Patricia had bought me for my 60th birthday, and waited for Sam to call. He called Monday evening. Sam's voice was different when he spoke. Careful, professional. The way people sound when they're about to destroy your world, but they're trying to be gentle about it. Derek and Monica were fine, he told me. Perfectly healthy. In fact, they'd been quite busy while I was in the hospital. They'd taken a long weekend trip to Monica's sister's place in Colorado, posted plenty of pictures on social media. Skiing, dinners out, family gatherings. They looked happy. Very happy. Sam paused, and I could hear him turning pages in his notebook. There was more, he said. Did I want to hear it over the phone, or would I prefer he come by the house? I told him to come by. Some news. You need to hear face to face. Sam arrived an hour later with a manila folder thick enough to choke a horse. He sat across from me in Patricia's old chair, the one I'd never had the heart to get rid of, and opened that folder like he was defusing a bomb. What he told me next. I'm not sure I can adequately describe the feeling of having your entire reality shifted on its axis. It's like finding out gravity works backwards, or that the sun sets in the east. It's a fundamental reorganization of everything you believed to be true. Derek and Monica hadn't just ignored my emergency. They'd been planning for it. For the past 2 years, while I'd been the doting father and grandfather, while I'd been writing checks and co-signing loans and babysitting grandchildren, they'd been systematically positioning themselves to inherit everything I owned. Sam had bank records. Derek had been added to several of my accounts as a joint owner, supposedly to help me manage my finances as I got older. I remembered signing those papers. Derek had been so concerned about me, so loving and attentive. He'd said it was just a precaution in case something happened to me and he needed to pay bills or handle emergencies. What I didn't know was that joint account ownership meant Derek could access those funds at any time. And he had been. Small amounts at first, a few hundred here and there, then larger sums. Over the past 18 months, Derek had withdrawn over $40,000 from my accounts. But the pattern of withdrawals told a story that was even more disturbing than the theft itself. Sam had printed out bank statements going back 2 years, and he walked me through the timeline with the methodical precision of a man who'd spent decades building criminal cases. The first unauthorized withdrawal had happened right after Patricia's first death anniversary. I'd been in a dark place that month, grieving harder than I had in years, and Derek had been particularly attentive. He'd called more often, visited more frequently, seemed genuinely concerned about my emotional state. I'd been so grateful for his attention that I'd added him to my checking account, just as he'd suggested. For emergencies, he'd said, just in case. 3 days later, he'd withdrawn $500. The memo line on the bank record said, emergency car repair. But Sam had done some digging. Derek's car hadn't needed any repairs that month. In fact, according to his social media posts, he and Monica had taken a weekend trip to wine country that same weekend. They'd used my emergency money for a romantic getaway while I was home alone, drowning in grief over my dead wife. The withdrawals had continued, always with plausible explanations in the memo lines. Medical expenses, home repairs, children's school costs. If I'd been paying attention to my statements, each withdrawal would have seemed reasonable in isolation. But Sam had also obtained Derek's credit card records and bank statements through methods he didn't elaborate on. The real story was there, written in restaurant charges and vacation bookings and luxury purchases that Derek's legitimate income couldn't support. My money hadn't been going to emergencies. It had been funding a lifestyle that Derek and Monica couldn't afford on their own. The expensive dinners out twice a week, the designer clothes Monica posted about on Instagram, the elaborate birthday parties for the grandchildren, with professional entertainers and catered food and party favors that cost more than some people spend on groceries in a month. The ski trips and beach vacations and weekend getaways that had become increasingly frequent over the past year. Derek had been living like a wealthy man using his father's money, while letting me believe I was helping with occasional emergencies. But that wasn't the worst part. Sam showed me copies of emails between Derek and Monica, messages he'd obtained through methods he didn't elaborate on, and I didn't ask about. The emails detailed their frustration with having to wait for their inheritance. They discussed my health, my age, my likelihood of living much longer. They talked about me like I was already dead. But they also talked about me like I was an obstacle to be managed, rather than a person to be loved. In one email chain that started 6 months before my heart attack, Monica had complained about having to attend my birthday dinner. I'm so tired of pretending to enjoy Eugene's stories about the old days. He tells the same ones every time we see him, and they get longer and more boring each time. I had to bite my tongue last night when he started that story about his first job again. I swear he's told that story 50 times. Derek's response had been worse. I know, but we have to keep him happy for now. He's been talking about updating his will again, and I want to make sure we stay on his good side until that's finalized. Just smile and nod and pretend to be interested. It won't be forever. Just smile and nod and pretend to be interested. It won't be forever. They'd been performing their love for me, counting down the days until they wouldn't have to pretend anymore. There were dozens of these emails going back almost 2 years. Complaints about my neediness, my loneliness, my desire to spend time with my family. Strategies for managing my expectations without giving me too much attention. Discussions about how to extract maximum financial benefit from our relationship while investing minimal emotional energy. One email from Monica to Derek, dated just 2 weeks before my heart attack, will be burned into my memory forever. I'm tired of pretending to care about your father's boring stories and having to include him in our vacation plans. The kids are getting older, and they're starting to ask questions about why Grandpa always wants to spend time with us. Eugene is 7 now. He's smart enough to see that we're just going through the motions. Maybe it's time to start pulling back. Create some distance. It'll make it easier later when we don't have to pretend to be devastated. Derek's response was even worse. You're right. Dad's getting more needy anyway, especially since the anniversary of Mom's death last year. I'm tired of the Sunday phone calls and the guilt trips about not visiting enough. Let's just let things fade naturally. He's old, Monica. How much longer can this really go on? And once he's gone, we can sell his house, liquidate the rest of his accounts, and finally take that trip to Europe we've been talking about. Derek had been planning my death like a business transaction. My funeral was an inconvenience he'd have to endure to collect his payment for years of pretending to love me. But even reading those emails, devastating as they were, didn't prepare me for what Sam showed me next. There were other emails, older ones, that revealed how long this had been going on. The decision to add Derek to my bank accounts hadn't been his idea, as I'd believed. It had been part of a calculated plan that Derek and Monica had developed over months. Monica had researched the legal requirements for joint account ownership, the inheritance implications, the tax consequences. She'd found articles about elderly people being financially exploited by their adult children and had used them as a blueprint rather than a warning. They'd studied how to manipulate me. In one particularly chilling email exchange, Monica had shared an article about the psychology of elderly parents, about how loneliness makes them vulnerable to financial manipulation, about how the fear of abandonment can be used to extract money and resources. Derek had responded with detailed observations about my emotional state, my grief patterns, my desperate need for family connection. He'd analyzed my weaknesses like a predator studying prey. Dad always gets sentimental around Mom's anniversary, Derek had written. That's when he's most vulnerable. He'd probably agree to anything if we approached it as helping him stay connected to us. We could position the joint account thing as letting us take care of him the way Mom would have wanted. They deliberately targeted my grief over Patricia's death, using my love for my dead wife to manipulate me into giving them access to my money. The joint account conversation had happened exactly 1 week after Patricia's death anniversary, just as Derek had planned. But the financial manipulation was only part of the story. Sam had also uncovered evidence of something even more disturbing. Derek and Monica had been actively isolating me from other relationships. When I'd mentioned making friends at the senior center, Derek had discouraged it, saying those places were depressing and full of people who just wanted to complain about their health problems. When I'd talked about joining a men's group at church, Monica had expressed concern that religious organizations were always asking for money, that I might be taken advantage of by people who didn't really care about me. When I'd considered taking a part-time job at the hardware store, just to have somewhere to go and people to talk to, Derek had insisted that I should be enjoying my retirement, that I'd worked hard enough and deserved to relax. Every time I'd shown interest in expanding my social circle, in finding sources of companionship and meaning outside of my family, Derek and Monica had found subtle ways to discourage it. They'd wanted me isolated and dependent on them for all my social and emotional needs. It made me easier to manipulate and less likely to have outside perspectives that might make me question their behavior. Sam showed me browser history from Derek's computer that revealed searches for terms like financial elder abuse, manipulating elderly parents, and how to access parents' bank account. But the most damning evidence was a document Sam had found on Derek's laptop, a detailed timeline of my expected death. Derek had researched life expectancy tables for men my age, factored in my health conditions and family medical history, and created a spreadsheet projecting how much longer I was likely to live. The spreadsheet included columns for my monthly income, my estimated expenses, and the amount of money Derek could expect to withdraw from my accounts each month without me noticing. It calculated the total inheritance Derek would receive when I died, minus the amount he projected spending on my funeral and estate settlement. The bottom line was a number that represented my worth to Derek, not as a father, but as a financial asset to be liquidated. According to Derek's calculations, I was worth more dead than alive. There were dozens of these emails, plans for after my death, discussions about whether they should keep any of my belongings or just donate everything, arguments about which of them would have to handle the funeral arrangements. Monica had advocated for cremation because it was cheaper and faster. Derek had agreed, noting that a traditional burial would eat into their inheritance unnecessarily. They'd already decided that my funeral would be small and brief, just immediate family, because a larger service would be expensive, and Monica didn't want to deal with Dad's old work friends and their boring stories. My own son and daughter-in-law had planned to skimp on my funeral to save money for their European vacation. They were planning my funeral while I was still alive. But even that wasn't the worst part. Sam showed me one more document, one that made everything else pale in comparison. A life insurance policy I'd forgotten about. A policy I'd taken out 15 years earlier with Derek as the beneficiary. The death benefit was $250,000. According to the emails, Derek and Monica knew about this policy. They'd been counting on it. But more than that, they'd been researching ways to ensure they'd collect it. Derek had contacted the insurance company multiple times over the past year, asking about the claims process, the documentation required to prove death, the typical timeline for benefit payments. He'd been preparing to file my death claim before I was even dead. And here's the part that made my blood run cold. In one of the emails, Monica had mentioned that heart attacks were often fatal, especially in men over 65. She'd even included a link to an article about cardiac mortality rates. But it wasn't just a casual observation. Monica had gone deeper than that. She'd researched the specific risk factors that increase the likelihood of fatal heart attacks. High cholesterol, which I had, diabetes, which ran in my family, stress, which I'd been under increasing amounts of as I worried about my relationship with Derek, sedentary lifestyle, which had become more of a problem since Patricia died and I'd lost my walking partner. Monica had compiled a profile of my health risks like she was building a case for why my death was not just likely, but imminent. And then, in the weeks leading up to my heart attack, Derek had begun increasing my stress levels in subtle but measurable ways. The Sunday phone calls had become shorter and more impersonal. When I'd tried to extend the conversations, Derek had become impatient and dismissive. The visits had become less frequent and more focused on what Derek needed from me rather than genuine family time. The requests for money had become more frequent and more urgent, creating financial pressure and worry about my own security. Derek had begun treating me like a burden, making me feel guilty for wanting time and attention from my own son. He'd systematically undermined my sense of security and belonging in my own family, creating exactly the kind of emotional stress that the articles Monica had researched identified as a major risk factor for cardiac events. They hadn't just hoped I would die. They'd been researching the likelihood of it happening and creating conditions that made it more likely to happen sooner rather than later. When Sam finished walking me through all the evidence, I sat in my living room in complete silence for what felt like hours. The documents were spread across my coffee table like pieces of a puzzle that, when assembled, created a picture I couldn't have imagined in my worst nightmares. My son and his wife hadn't just been stealing from me. They'd been systematically destroying my emotional and physical health to speed up my death so they could collect their inheritance faster. The heart attack that had nearly killed me wasn't just a medical event. It was the culmination of a deliberate campaign of psychological and financial abuse designed to push me toward an early grave. I sat in my living room that night, surrounded by the evidence of my son's betrayal, and I felt something I'd never experienced before. It wasn't just anger or hurt or disappointment. It was a cold, calculating rage that settled into my bones like winter. Derek and Monica had made a mistake. They'd assumed I would die from that heart attack. They'd planned for a world without me in it. But I was very much alive. And now I knew exactly who they really were. Was $250,000. According to the emails, Derek and Monica knew about this policy. They'd been counting on it. And here's the part that made my blood run cold. In one of the emails, Monica had mentioned that heart attacks were often fatal, especially in men over 65. She'd even included a link to an article about cardiac mortality rates. They hadn't just hoped I would die. They'd been researching the likelihood of it happening. I sat in my living room that night surrounded by the evidence of my son's betrayal, and I felt something I'd never experienced before. It wasn't just anger or hurt or disappointment. It was a cold, calculating rage that settled into my bones like winter. Derek and Monica had made a mistake. They'd assumed I would die from that heart attack. They'd planned for a world without me in it. But I was very much alive. And now I knew exactly who they really were. The next morning, I called my lawyer, Harold Brennan, a man I'd known for 25 years. Harold had handled my will, my business affairs, Patricia's estate when she died. He was more than my lawyer. He was my friend. When I told Harold what I'd discovered, he was quiet for a long time. Finally, he asked if I was sure I wanted to proceed with what I was thinking. He warned me that there might be no going back, that some actions have consequences that last forever. I told him I'd never been more sure of anything in my life. The first thing Harold did was help me remove Derek from all my bank accounts. We did it quietly, without notification, as was my legal right. We also changed the beneficiary on my life insurance policy, transferring it to a charity Patricia and I had supported when she was alive. But that was just the beginning. Over the next several weeks, while Derek and Monica continued to ignore me completely, I began to systematically undo every financial favor I'd ever done for them. But I didn't stop there. With Harold's help and Sam's continued investigation, I began to understand the full scope of what Derek and Monica had done to me, and I realized that simply cutting off their financial access wasn't enough. They'd spent 2 years planning my death and spending my money. They deserved to understand what real consequences felt like. Remember that business loan I'd co-signed for Derek? Harold found a clause that allowed me to call in the debt immediately if the borrower defaulted on any terms of the agreement. Derek had been late on 2 payments in the past year. Technically, he was in default. But Harold also discovered something else. Derek had been using his business account, the one I'd helped him establish, the one that was built on my credit and my co-signature, for personal expenses. Expensive dinners, family vacations, luxury purchases that had nothing to do with his consulting work. That was fraud. Not just against the lender, but against me as the co-signer who was ultimately responsible for the debt. Harold suggested we could pursue criminal charges. Derek could face jail time for misuse of business funds and fraudulent use of credit obtained through false pretenses. I decided to hold that option in reserve. I called in the loan. Remember the house mortgage I'd co-signed? Same situation. There were property tax payments that were overdue, utilities that had been paid late, small infractions that most co-signers would overlook. But Harold had discovered something even more damaging. Derek and Monica had taken out a second mortgage on the house without notifying me, despite the fact that my co-signature on the original mortgage gave me legal rights to be informed about additional liens against the property. They'd used my house, the house I'd helped them buy, as collateral for another $40,000 in debt that they'd spent on what Sam's investigation revealed to be a failed investment scheme Monica had gotten involved in. Some kind of multi-level marketing business that promised huge returns, but had collapsed within 6 months, taking their money with it. They'd gambled away $40,000 and hidden the loss from me, even though I was legally liable for the debt as co-signer on the original mortgage. I didn't overlook them. Harold sent Derek a formal notice that I was exercising my rights as co-signer to demand immediate payment of all outstanding debts. The total amount due was over $300,000. But we didn't stop there. Harold also filed a formal complaint with the mortgage company about Derek's failure to disclose the second mortgage, and initiated proceedings to have me removed as co-signer due to his violations of the original agreement terms, which meant that Derek would lose not just my financial backing, but his favorable interest rate and loan terms. He'd be forced to refinance at current market rates, with his own credit, at a time when his credit score was already damaged by the late payments and defaults Harold had documented. Derek had 30 days to pay, or face foreclosure and bankruptcy. But even if he somehow managed to come up with the money, he'd still lose the financial advantages my co-signature had provided. 3 days after Harold sent the notice, my phone rang for the first time in a month. It was Derek. His voice was panicked, confused, hurt. He didn't understand what was happening. Why was I doing this to him? Had he done something wrong? Could we please meet and talk about this like family? Like family. But I wasn't done yet. While Derek was leaving increasingly desperate voicemails, I was working with Harold and Sam on the next phase of my plan. See, Derek and Monica had made another mistake in their emails. They'd discussed not just their plans for my money, but their plans for my property, my belongings, my entire estate. Monica had already been browsing real estate websites, looking at the current market value of my house. She'd saved listings for similar properties, calculated what they could expect to get if they sold quickly versus if they invested in improvements first. Derek had made lists of my belongings that had value: my car, Patricia's jewelry, my tools, even my furniture. He'd researched auction houses and estate sale companies. They'd been planning to liquidate my entire life, and they'd been stupid enough to put it all in writing. Harold explained that this gave us grounds for what's called a constructive fraud case. Derek and Monica had breached their fiduciary duty to me by secretly planning to profit from my death while pretending to care about my welfare. But more than that, their emails revealed a pattern of what legal experts call financial elder abuse, deliberately isolating an elderly person, manipulating their emotions, and systematically draining their resources. Elder abuse isn't just a civil matter, it's a crime, a felony in our state, punishable by up to 10 years in prison and complete financial restitution. Harold helped me document everything: the unauthorized bank withdrawals, the hidden debts, the evidence of deliberate emotional manipulation, the research into my death, and their preparation to profit from it. We had enough evidence to send Derek and Monica to prison for a very long time, but I still wasn't ready to make that call. There was something else I wanted to do first. I told Derek I'd be happy to meet with him. I suggested we meet at the same hospital where I'd had my surgery, in the same waiting room where he should have been sitting while I was fighting for my life. Derek agreed immediately. He would have agreed to meet anywhere, under any conditions. He was desperate. When I walked into that hospital waiting room and saw my son sitting there, I felt a strange sense of completion. He looked older than I remembered, more worried, more desperate. He'd lost weight. There were dark circles under his eyes. For a moment, sitting in that waiting room, I could see the toll that the past month had taken on him. The stress of the financial pressures I'd created? Yes. But something else too. Something that looked almost like grief. He stood when he saw me, and for just a moment I could see the little boy he used to be. The kid who'd run to me when he scraped his knee, who'd crawled into my bed during thunderstorms, who'd cried when I taught him to ride a bike because he was afraid I'd let go. But then I remembered the emails. I remembered the plans they'd made for my funeral. I remembered lying alone in that hospital bed, waiting for a son who never came because he was too busy planning how to spend my life insurance money. Derek started talking immediately, a stream of apologies and explanations that washed over me like noise. He was sorry he hadn't come to the hospital. There had been a family emergency with Monica's sister. His phone had been broken. He'd tried to get back, but there had been flight delays. Lies. All of it. Lies told by a man who was desperate to save himself. But I'd learned something important over the past month. I'd learned that Derek was an excellent liar when he needed to be. His explanations were detailed and emotional and almost believable. If I hadn't seen Sam's evidence, if I hadn't read the emails, I might have been tempted to believe him. Derek was a skilled manipulator. He'd probably been manipulating me for years, and I'd been too grateful for his attention to notice. I let him talk. I let him spin his web of excuses and false concern. I let him tell me how much he loved me, how worried he'd been, how grateful he was that I was okay. And then I told him I knew everything. The color drained from Derek's face like someone had pulled a plug. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked exactly like a fish pulled from water, gasping and helpless. I told him about Sam Kowalski. I told him about the bank records, the emails, the evidence of systematic financial abuse. I told him about the research into my death and the preparations to collect my life insurance. Derek tried to deny it at first, then tried to minimize it, then tried to blame Monica. It was her idea, he said. She'd pushed him into it. He'd never wanted to hurt me. He'd just gotten caught up in something that had spiraled out of control. But I'd read those emails. I'd seen his detailed analysis of my psychological vulnerabilities. I'd read his calculations about how much money he could steal each month without me noticing. Derek hadn't been reluctantly dragged into Monica's scheme. He'd been an active, enthusiastic participant. Finally, Derek broke down completely. He cried like the child he'd once been, begging me to forgive him, promising it would never happen again, swearing that he loved me despite everything I'd discovered. And you know what? Part of me wanted to believe him. Part of me wanted to take him in my arms and tell him it was okay, that we could work through this, that family means forgiveness. But then I thought about those 3 days in the hospital. I thought about the social worker with her brochures. I thought about coming home alone to a house that felt like a tomb. I thought about them planning my funeral while I was still alive. I thought about Derek researching how quickly heart attacks kill men my age. I thought about Monica systematically increasing my stress levels to improve their odds of collecting my life insurance sooner rather than later. So instead, I told Derek about the loan I'd called in. I told him about the mortgage co-signing I'd revoked. I told him he had 27 days left to come up with $300,000 or lose everything. Derek's face went through several expressions in quick succession: shock, disbelief, anger, and finally, desperation. He asked me what I wanted. What would it take to make this go away? He could change, he said. He could be better. He could be the son I deserved. Money, he offered. He could pay back everything he'd taken with interest. He could sign over his business to me as collateral. He could do anything I asked if I would just give him a chance to make this right. But I told him there was nothing he could give me that I wanted anymore. The damage was done. The relationship was over. Derek became frantic then. He couldn't lose his house, he said. Monica would leave him. The kids would have to change schools. His business would collapse without my backing. Everything would be ruined. I told him he should have thought about those consequences before he started stealing from me and planning my death, but that wasn't entirely true. There was something I wanted from Derek, something I hadn't told Harold about because I knew he'd try to talk me out of it. I wanted him to understand what it felt like to be truly alone. I wanted him to experience the same abandonment he'd forced me to endure. I wanted him to know what it was like to need your family desperately and have them turn away. So I made Derek an offer. I would forgive all the debts. I would restore him to my accounts and my will. I would pretend none of this had ever happened. But there was a condition. Derek and Monica had to cut all contact with me for 1 full year. No phone calls, no visits, no birthday cards, or Christmas presents. They had to block my number and refuse to see me if I showed up at their door. They had to tell the grandchildren that Grandpa was too busy to spend time with them anymore. They had to abandon me completely, the same way they'd abandoned me when I was dying in that hospital. And during that year, they had to live with the knowledge that I knew exactly who they were. They had to wonder every day whether I would change my mind, whether I would decide to pursue criminal charges after all. whether their comfortable life built on my generosity would come crashing down around them. They had to live with the uncertainty they'd tried to force on me by manipulating my health and planning my death. Derek stared at me like I'd lost my mind. Why would I want that? Why would I choose to be alone? I told him he'd understand eventually. Derek tried to argue, tried to negotiate, tried to find some other solution. But I'd made up my mind. Those were my terms. He could agree to them, or he could find $300,000 in the next 3 weeks. Or, I added, he could take his chances with the criminal charges that Harold was prepared to file. Elder abuse, fraud, theft, conspiracy. Prison time that would destroy his business, his marriage, his relationship with his children. He had 3 options. Agree to my terms, pay the money he didn't have, or go to jail. Derek chose to agree to my terms. But as he was leaving the hospital that day, I gave him one more thing to think about. I told him that the year of separation wasn't just punishment. It was an opportunity for him to decide who he really wanted to be, what kind of man he wanted to be, what kind of father he wanted his children to remember. I told him that when the year was over, if he could honestly say that he'd used the time to become someone worthy of my forgiveness, then maybe we could try to rebuild something real between us. But if he spent the year feeling sorry for himself, blaming me for the consequences of his own choices, plotting some new way to manipulate or use me, then the separation would become permanent, and he'd face those criminal charges after all. I gave him a choice. Use the year to become a better man, or lose me forever. The next year was the longest year of my life, but it was also the most important. For the first few months I was miserable. I'd gotten exactly what I'd asked for, complete isolation from my family, but having it felt worse than I'd imagined. The silence was deafening. The loneliness was crushing. I thought about calling Derek 100 times. I thought about ending the arrangement, admitting I'd made a mistake, begging him to come back. But I didn't. Instead, I started to learn how to be alone. I started to discover who Eugene Matthews was when he wasn't defined by being someone's father or grandfather. I took up painting, something I'd always wanted to try but never had time for when I was working or helping Derek with his endless crises. I joined a book club at the library and discovered I had opinions about literature that had nothing to do with what anyone else needed from me. I started volunteering at a local homeless shelter, serving meals and listening to stories from people who'd lost everything. I learned that loneliness wasn't unique to me, that abandonment came in many forms, and that survival was possible even when the people you loved most turned away. I made new friends, real friends, people who chose to spend time with me because they enjoyed my company, not because they needed something from me. Slowly, painfully, I began to heal. And as I healed, I began to understand something Derek couldn't have anticipated when he agreed to my terms. The year of abandonment wasn't punishment for him. It was freedom for me. For the first time since Patricia died, I wasn't waiting for Derek to call. I wasn't wondering if I should visit the grandchildren or if I was being too pushy. I wasn't worrying about whether I was giving enough money or helping enough with their problems. I was just living my own life. The revelation hit me about 8 months into our arrangement. I was sitting in my backyard, painting a sunset and listening to birds sing in the oak tree Patricia and I had planted 30 years earlier, when I realized something profound. I wasn't angry anymore. The rage that had consumed me for months, the desire for revenge that had driven me to make Derek abandon me, had transformed into something else entirely. Acceptance. I accepted that Derek and Monica were not the people I'd thought they were. I accepted that the relationship I'd believed we had was largely a fiction I'd created to avoid facing difficult truths. I accepted that love, real love, can't be forced or bought or manipulated into existence. And I accepted that being alone wasn't the same thing as being abandoned. When Derek called me on the anniversary of our agreement, I almost didn't answer the phone. His voice was different, humbler, more uncertain. He asked if he could come see me, if we could talk about rebuilding our relationship. I told him he could come, But I wanted him to understand something first. The year was over, but I wasn't the same person who'd made that agreement. I wasn't the father who'd do anything, pay anything, sacrifice anything to maintain a relationship with his son. If Derek wanted me in his life, he'd have to earn it. And he'd have to want me for who I really was, not for what I could give him. Derek came to see me the next day. Monica wasn't with him. He looked different too. Older, more weathered. He'd aged more in that 1 year than I had. We sat in my living room, the same room where Sam Kowalski had shown me the evidence of Derek's betrayal, and my son told me about his year. It had been harder than he'd expected, he said. Not just financially, though the stress of almost losing everything had been overwhelming, but emotionally. He'd realized how much he'd taken me for granted, how much he'd relied on my presence in his life without ever really appreciating it, how much he'd used my love as a safety net while never offering the same security in return. The grandchildren had asked about me constantly. Why didn't Grandpa come to birthday parties anymore? Why didn't he call? Had they done something wrong? Derek had been forced to explain, in terms a child could understand, that Grandpa needed space, that sometimes grown-ups had to work out their problems, and that meant spending time apart. Little Eugene, my namesake, had cried. He'd asked if Grandpa still loved him, if he'd ever see me again. Derek said that was the moment he understood what he'd really lost when he'd betrayed me. Not just money or financial security, but love. Real, unconditional love from someone who'd never asked for anything in return except to be included in their lives. He apologized. Not the desperate, self-serving apology he'd offered in the hospital waiting room, but a real one. He took responsibility for his actions, acknowledged the pain he'd caused, and admitted that he'd been wrong to see me as an obstacle to overcome, rather than a person to cherish. I listened to everything Derek said, and I believed him. The year of separation had changed him too, taught him lessons he couldn't have learned any other way. But I also knew that trust, once broken, couldn't be repaired with words alone. So I made Derek another offer. We could rebuild our relationship, but it would be different this time. I would no longer be the father who gave without boundaries, who said yes to every request, who prioritized his son's needs above his own well-being. If Derek wanted financial help in the future, he'd have to ask for it honestly and accept my right to say no. If he wanted my time and attention, he'd have to offer the same in return. If he wanted to be part of my life, he'd have to prove that my presence in his life mattered to him. I told Derek about the friends I'd made during our year apart, about the activities I'd discovered, about the life I'd built that didn't revolve around being his father. I was willing to make room for him in that life, but I wasn't willing to give up myself to accommodate him anymore. Derek agreed to my terms. More importantly, he seemed to understand them. We started slowly. A phone call once a week, a dinner once a month, visits with the grandchildren that were planned in advance and limited in scope. Monica was a different story. When Derek told her about our new arrangement, she was furious. She didn't understand why I couldn't just forgive and forget, why I had to make their reconciliation so complicated. She never apologized for her role in the betrayal. She never acknowledged the pain she'd caused. Instead, she acted like I was being unreasonable, like I was punishing Derek for something that had been blown out of proportion. I told Derek that Monica was welcome in my home, but only if she could treat me with genuine respect. I wouldn't pretend that her emails hadn't existed, and I wouldn't tolerate being treated like an inconvenience in my own life. Monica chose to stay away. Even now, 3 years later, our interactions are minimal and formal. She comes to family gatherings but keeps her distance. She's polite but cold, treating me like an acquaintance rather than family. That's fine with me. I learned during my year alone that authentic relationships are worth more than artificial peace. Derek, though, has kept his promises. He calls when he says he will. He includes me in his decisions, not because he needs my money, but because he values my opinion. He brings the grandchildren to visit regularly, and those visits are filled with genuine joy rather than obligation. Last month, little Eugene asked me if I was angry at his dad anymore. Kids are perceptive. They pick up on tensions even when adults try to hide them. I told him I wasn't angry, and that was the truth. I explained that sometimes grown-ups have to work very hard to learn how to love each other properly, and that his dad and I had done that work. But I also told him something else, something I hope he'll remember when he's grown and facing his own complicated relationships. I told him that loving someone doesn't mean you have to accept being treated badly by them. That forgiveness doesn't mean pretending bad things didn't happen. That family isn't an excuse for cruelty, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is require people to earn their place in your life. The grandchildren are older now. Little Eugene is 10, Sarah is 8. They're smart kids, curious about the world, and full of questions about everything from why the sky is blue to why some families live together and others don't. When they ask about why things were different for a while between their dad and me, Derek tells them an age-appropriate version of the truth. He explains that he made mistakes that hurt Grandpa's feelings, and that it took time to fix those mistakes and rebuild trust. He doesn't try to hide from his failures, and he doesn't try to make them seem smaller than they were. I respect him for that. The kids seem to understand, at least as much as children can understand complex adult emotions. More importantly, they can see that their father and I love each other, even though that love has been tested and changed. I think that's a valuable lesson for them to learn early, that love is not fragile, but it is precious, that it can survive almost anything, but it shouldn't have to survive everything. People ask me sometimes if I regret what I did, if I regret forcing Derek to abandon me for a year, if I regret the pain we all went through during that time. The answer is complicated. I regret that it was necessary. I regret that Derek and Monica's betrayal made such drastic action feel like the only option. I regret the year of loneliness and the damage done to my relationships with my grandchildren. But I don't regret learning who I am when I'm not being used. I don't regret discovering that I could survive being alone. I don't regret forcing Derek to confront the reality of what he'd done and what he'd lost. Most of all, I don't regret refusing to accept love that came with conditions while offering love that had none. The hardest lesson I learned through all of this was that unconditional love doesn't mean unconditional acceptance of bad behavior. You can love someone completely while still requiring them to treat you with respect. You can forgive someone entirely while still protecting yourself from future harm. For too many years, I confused being a good father with being a doormat. I thought that loving Derek meant saying yes to everything he asked for, meant ignoring warning signs about his character, meant prioritizing his comfort over my own well-being. That wasn't love. That was enablement disguised as love. Real love requires boundaries. It requires honesty about difficult truths. It requires the willingness to risk conflict in service of something deeper and more authentic. When I forced Derek to abandon me, I wasn't trying to hurt him. I was trying to show him what he'd already done to me, what he'd been doing for years without realizing it. The abandonment had already happened. I just made it visible. Derek learned during our year apart that having me in his life wasn't a burden to be tolerated, but a gift to be treasured. He learned that my love wasn't guaranteed, that relationships require effort and care and genuine investment from both sides. I learned that I was stronger than I'd given myself credit for. I learned that loneliness, while painful, wasn't fatal. I learned that the fear of being alone had made me accept treatment I never should have tolerated. Today, Derek and I have a relationship that's smaller than what we had before, but it's also more honest. We see each other less frequently, but our time together is more meaningful. He asks me for less money, but when he does ask, it's with genuine need and real gratitude. Monica and I will probably never be close again, and I've made my peace with that. She chose to see me as an obstacle rather than an opportunity, and that's a choice she'll have to live with. The grandchildren are thriving. They have a grandfather who loves them completely, and a father who's learned to model healthy boundaries and authentic relationships. They're learning that love is not about what you can get from someone, but about what you can give. If I died tomorrow, I would die knowing that Derek truly loves me, not because I've given him money or made his life easier, but because he's chosen to value me as a person. I would die knowing that our relationship, while scarred, is built on truth rather than convenience. That's worth more than all the money I ever gave him. It's worth more than all the years I spent trying to buy his attention and affection. It's worth the year I spent learning how to be alone. 3 months ago, Derek did something that surprised me. He came to my house on a Sunday afternoon, not for any special occasion or family gathering, just because he wanted to spend time with me. We sat in my backyard, in the shade of the oak tree Patricia and I had planted, and he told me about a decision he was struggling with at work. He didn't want money or advice, really. He just wanted to talk through his thoughts with someone he trusted. As we talked, I realized something profound. Derek wasn't there because he needed something from me. He was there because he wanted to include me in his life, because my perspective mattered to him, because being with me brought him joy rather than obligation. That afternoon felt like a gift, not because Derek was finally being the son I'd always wanted, but because I was finally being the father I'd always been capable of being. A father who was valued for who he was, not just for what he could provide. A father who could say no without losing love, and who could offer help without enabling dependence. A father who understood the difference between being needed and being wanted. When Derek left that day, he hugged me tighter than he had in years. He told me he loved me, and I could hear the truth in his voice. As I watched him drive away, I thought about the man I'd been 3 years earlier. The man who'd been so desperate for his son's love that he'd been willing to accept crumbs and call them a feast. The man who'd been so afraid of being alone that he'd tolerated being treated as an inconvenience. That man was gone. He died in that hospital room, abandoned by the people he loved most. What had emerged from his death was someone stronger, someone wiser, someone who understood that the most important relationship you have is the one you have with yourself. I still miss the easy relationship Derek and I used to have, the one where he called every Sunday and I said yes to every request. But I don't miss the anxiety that came with it, the constant worry about whether I was doing enough, giving enough, being enough. I don't miss feeling like I had to earn my place in my son's life. The revenge I'd planned had turned into something else entirely. It had become a gift to Derek, who learned what love really means, and to myself, who learned that I was worth more than I'd believed. Sometimes the most devastating thing you can do to someone who's taken you for granted isn't to hurt them back. It's to show them what life looks like without you in it. It's to force them to choose you deliberately, rather than accepting you by default. Sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to be disposable. As I sit here now, 3 years after that heart attack that changed everything, I'm surrounded by a life that feels authentic in a way my old life never did. I have friends who choose my company, hobbies that fulfill me, relationships that nourish rather than drain me. I have a son who loves me by choice rather than obligation, grandchildren who are excited to see me rather than resigned to my presence, and a sense of my own worth that doesn't depend on anyone else's validation. I have learned that being alone and being lonely are two entirely different things, and I have learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone who's lost their way is to stop making it easy for them to stay lost. Derek found his way back to me, but he had to choose to make that journey. I couldn't force him to value me, but I could refuse to accept being devalued. That refusal saved us both. If you're watching this and you recognize yourself in my story, if you're the parent who gives too much, the spouse who accepts too little, the friend who's always available but never prioritized, then I want you to understand something important. You are not required to set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm. You are not obligated to accept crumbs from someone else's table while calling it a feast. You are not responsible for making it easy for people to treat you badly. The people who truly love you will prove it through their actions, not just their words. They will show up when you need them, not just when they need something from you. They will treat your time, your energy, your resources as precious rather than endless. And if they don't, if they take you for granted, if they use you without gratitude, if they plan their lives around your absence rather than your presence, then maybe it's time to show them what that absence actually looks like. Not out of cruelty, but out of love. Love for them, because sometimes people need to lose something precious before they understand its value. And love for yourself, because you deserve better than being someone's convenience store. Always open, always available, never truly appreciated. The year I forced Derek to abandon me was the hardest year of my life, but it was also the most important. It taught me that I could survive being alone, that my worth wasn't determined by how useful I was to other people, and that authentic love was worth fighting for even when the fight seemed impossible. It taught Derek that I wasn't a given, that my presence in his life was a choice I made every day, and that choices can change. Most importantly, it taught us both the difference between being family and acting like family. Blood makes you related, but love makes you family. And love, real love, requires effort from everyone involved. I'm 67 years old now, and I've learned more about love in the past 3 years than I learned in all the years before. I've learned that boundaries aren't walls meant to keep people out, but gates that let the right people in. I've learned that saying no to the wrong things makes it possible to say yes to the right things. I've learned that the strongest relationships are built on mutual respect, not mutual need. Derek and I still have work to do. Trust, once broken, takes time to fully rebuild. But we're doing that work together now, as equals rather than as user and used. Monica may never come around, and I've accepted that. Not everyone is capable of the kind of growth that real relationships require. Some people would rather lose something beautiful than admit they were wrong. The grandchildren are getting older, and they're watching how Derek and I navigate our complicated relationship. They're learning that love sometimes requires difficult conversations, that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and that the people who truly care about you will work to earn your trust back when they've broken it. Those are valuable lessons for children to learn. More valuable, I think, than the lesson they would have learned if I'd simply accepted Derek's betrayal and continued as if nothing had happened. That lesson would have been that love means accepting mistreatment, that family excuses any behavior, that your own worth is determined by how much others are willing to take from you. I refused to teach my grandchildren that lesson, even though refusing meant risking everything. Last week, little Eugene asked me why I paint so much now. He's noticed that my house is full of canvases, that I spend hours in the backyard with brushes and colors, capturing sunsets and storms and the changing seasons. I told him that painting teaches you to really see things, not just to look at them, but to understand their colors and shadows, their beauty and their flaws. I told him that when you really see something, you appreciate it more. He nodded solemnly, the way children do when they're processing something important, and then asked if I saw him and his sister differently now than I used to. The question caught me off guard, but the answer came easily. I told him that I saw him more clearly now, and that seeing him clearly made me love him even more. I told him that sometimes grown-ups get so busy trying to make everyone happy that they forget to really see the people they love. But now, I see him exactly as he is. Funny and smart and kind and occasionally stubborn. And that's exactly who I want him to be. He seemed satisfied with that answer, and he asked if I would teach him to paint. So now, on Sunday afternoons, little Eugene comes to my house and we sit in the backyard together, trying to capture the light filtering through the oak tree's leaves. He's not very good at it yet, but he's enthusiastic and patient with himself in the way that children often are. Those Sunday painting sessions have become one of my favorite parts of the week. Not because little Eugene needs me to teach him, he could learn to paint from anyone, but because he chooses to spend that time with me. Because being together brings us both joy. That's what healthy relationships look like. They're not built on need or obligation or guilt. They're built on mutual choice, mutual respect, mutual benefit. Derek joins us sometimes and we paint together in comfortable silence. 3 generations of Matthew's men trying to capture beauty on canvas. Derek isn't very good at painting either, but he's learning to be patient with the process, to accept that some things take time and practice and can't be rushed. Those are lessons that apply to more than just art. Monica doesn't join our painting sessions. She's still uncomfortable with the new dynamic between Derek and me, still resentful of the boundaries I've established. She views my expectations of respect and reciprocity as unreasonable demands rather than basic relationship requirements. That's her choice to make, and I respect it, even though I don't understand it. Derek has tried to bridge the gap between his wife and his father, but he's learned that he can't force relationships that other people aren't willing to invest in. He's learned that loyalty to family doesn't mean choosing sides, but it does mean refusing to accept when one family member mistreats another. It's been difficult for him at times, navigating between a wife who wants him to reject my boundaries and a father who requires those boundaries for the relationship to continue. But Derek has chosen to honor both relationships within their respective limits. He spends time with me on his own, and he includes Monica in family gatherings where everyone can be polite and respectful even if they can't be warm. It's not perfect, but it's honest. And honesty, I've learned, is the foundation that real relationships are built on. 3 weeks ago, Derek called me on a Tuesday evening, not because it was our scheduled call time, but because he'd had a particularly difficult day at work and wanted to talk to someone who understood him. We talked for over an hour about his business challenges, his concerns about the kids, his worries about the future. It was the kind of conversation fathers and sons should have, the kind where both people feel heard and valued. Near the end of the call, Derek said something that stayed with me. He told me that he'd been thinking about the year we'd spent apart, and he realized now that it hadn't been punishment. It had been an education. He'd learned what life felt like without me in it, and it had felt empty in ways he hadn't expected. Not just practically, though he'd missed my help and support, but emotionally. He'd missed my perspective, my sense of humor, my presence at important moments. He'd realized that I wasn't just a resource to be managed or a problem to be solved. I was a person whose company he genuinely enjoyed, whose absence left a hole in his life that couldn't be filled by anyone else. That realization had changed how he approached our relationship when we reconciled. Instead of seeing me as someone who was always there, someone whose presence he could take for granted, he began to see me as someone he was lucky to have in his life, someone he needed to actively choose and actively cherish. Derek told me that the year apart had been the most difficult year of his adult life, but also the most important. It had forced him to grow in ways he wouldn't have grown otherwise, to confront truths about himself that he'd been avoiding. He thanked me for being strong enough to walk away when he wasn't strong enough to do better. Those words meant more to me than any apology, any promise, any gesture of affection. They meant that Derek understood not just what he'd done wrong, but why my response had been necessary. They meant that he'd learned the lesson I'd been trying to teach him, that love without respect isn't really love at all. As we end this story, I want you to know that I'm not telling you all this to make you feel sorry for me, or to make you angry at Derek and Monica, or to convince you that my way of handling betrayal was the only right way. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that you have choices. When someone you love mistreats you, you don't have to accept it just because love is supposed to be unconditional. When someone takes you for granted, you don't have to keep making yourself available just because that's what you've always done. You can choose to walk away, even temporarily, even when it's scary and painful and uncertain. You can choose to require better treatment, even when that requirement risks losing the relationship entirely. You can choose to love yourself enough to demand that others love you properly. Those choices are hard. They require courage and strength and the willingness to be alone rather than accepting a relationship that diminishes you. But those choices are also liberating. They free you from relationships built on need rather than want, from love that comes with impossible conditions, from the exhausting work of trying to earn what should be freely given. My relationship with Derek today is smaller than what we had before, but it's also deeper. We see each other less frequently, but our time together is more meaningful. He asks me for less, but he offers me more. That trade was worth making. If you're in a situation like I was, if you're giving more than you're receiving, if you're being taken for granted by people who claim to love you, if you're afraid to set boundaries because you might lose relationships that aren't serving you anyway, then I want you to consider the possibility that walking away might be the most loving thing you can do. Not just for them, but for yourself. You deserve to be chosen, not just accepted. You deserve to be valued, not just tolerated. You deserve relationships that add to your life rather than draining it. And if the people in your life can't offer you those things, then maybe it's time to show them what life looks like without you in it. Not forever, necessarily, but long enough for them to understand what they've been taking for granted. Long enough for you to remember who you are when you're not being used. Long enough for both of you to decide if you want to build something better together. The revenge I planned turned into redemption. For Derek, who learned to love properly, and for me, who learned that I was worth being loved properly. That's the best kind of revenge there is. The kind that makes everyone better. The kind that turns pain into growth, betrayal into wisdom, loss into the foundation for something stronger. 3 years ago, I thought my life was over when I had that heart attack. I thought I was dying alone, abandoned by the son I'd sacrificed everything for. But I wasn't dying. I was being reborn into someone who understood his own worth, into someone who could love without losing himself, into someone who could forgive without forgetting, who could rebuild without returning to what was broken. Today I'm surrounded by relationships that nourish me rather than drain me. I have a son who chooses me daily rather than accepting me reluctantly. I have grandchildren who are excited to see me rather than obligated to spend time with me. I have a life that feels authentic and meaningful and entirely my own. And I have the knowledge that love, real love, can survive almost anything, including the truth. If this story resonates with you, if you see yourself in my journey, then I hope you'll take from it what I learned. That you are worth fighting for, even when the person you have to fight is someone you love. Especially when the person you have to fight is someone you love. Because sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is refuse to make it easy for people to treat you badly. Sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is walk away. And sometimes, the best revenge is simply becoming someone who can't be taken for granted anymore. Thank you for listening to my story. If it helped you in any way, if it made you think about your own relationships differently, then please share it with someone who might need to hear it. Because there are too many people out there accepting less than they deserve from people who claim to love them. There are too many parents being used by their children, too many spouses being taken for granted by their partners, too many friends being treated as convenient rather than cherished. If you're one of those people, then I want you to know, you have options. You have power. You have the right to require better. And you have the strength to walk away if better isn't offered. I promise you that. The man who survived that heart attack 3 years ago, the man who learned to be alone rather than accept being abandoned while still being present, he promises you that you're stronger than you know, more valuable than they've made you feel, and worthy of love that doesn't come with conditions that diminish you. Take that promise with you. And remember, the people who truly love you will prove it when you stop making it easy for them to avoid the effort. That's when you'll know who your real family is.